In this lesson, we're going to talk about how Canada expanded to the west after Confederation. Let's start with some review. So Confederation, that's when Canada became its own country, no longer just directly governed by Britain, but its own country within the British Empire, took place in, pause for a sec, look through your notes, see if you can figure out what year it took place in. It took place in the year 1867. So I'm going to type this in and you can put it into your notes. 1867. And the first provinces that joined the country were, make sure to look through your notes and see if you can find this, but they were Ontario, Quebec, I'm wrong about that, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick. So first, there were only 4 provinces in Canada in 1867. Let's take a look at what kind of British North America looks like in 1867. So I'm going to label some of it in red, and I'm going to label that as Canada. So I'm just going to put that in the map key here. And Canada included at that time what's now Ontario down here, plus Quebec, plus New Brunswick, plus Nova Scotia. Didn't include PEI. PEI didn't join at first. And then around this northern part of Quebec. And so this part I've outlined in red is the part that at that point, the part of British North America that was the own independent country of Canada. Now, there was another kind of territory, I'm going to put that one in pink, called Rupert's Land. Rupert's Land is the land that the Hudson's Bay Company controlled. And the British had said, okay, Hudson's Bay Company, you're in charge of this giant swath of land. All the land where the rivers drain into Hudson's Bay back in the 1600s. Of course, the British had obviously not asked, the indigenous people whether they were okay with that, but that's another story. So this whole area would have been what we call Rupert's Land, named after a British prince named Prince Rupert, and it's all the land that drains into Hudson's Bay, and it was owned by the Hudson's Bay Company. Now, there were also some other British colonies. So kind of 3 big ones in North America at the time that would have been other British colonies. There was Newfoundland, which didn't join Confederation, even though it had been invited. They didn't join Confederation. They thought it wouldn't be a good deal for them. They didn't actually join for about almost 100 years later, until 1949. PEI, although they joined Confederation pretty soon after Confederation started. And then the other British colony, way out on the Pacific, was, of course, British Columbia, which included Vancouver Island, Haida Gwaii, and the mainland. And then there's something also that the British would have called other British lands. And these are just lands that are in the rest of Canada, not very densely populated, but the British just claimed that they own these. Of course, again, not really asking the indigenous people. And so that includes all the kind of parts of Yukon, Northwest Territories, the very high Arctic, what's now Nunavut. And again, very few British people were up here, but the British claimed it, despite the fact that the Inuit and other indigenous people who lived up here wouldn't have agreed. The key thing to remember here, though, is that these are kind of the 4 different kinds of British land that were there. Canada is the only part that's kind of self-governing, is independent of Britain. But of course, most people in Canada thought of themselves as British and cared about being British, and that was really important to them. So that's the map of Canada after 1867. Happened with the first 4 provinces, how we brought in Manitoba, which was kind of the first step to bringing in the entire prairies, the entire kind of great western part of the country into Confederation and into Canada. So the British government supported Confederation. They thought it was a good idea, this whole Canada thing. So they persuaded the Hudson's Bay Company to sell Rupert's Land to Canada in 1870. And on your map, that's the whole area that we colored in pink, the whole area that drains into Hudson's Bay. In the Red River Colony, so what's today Winnipeg, there was a large community of Scottish settlers, as well as a new group of indigenous people, the Métis. And so, that's in Rupert's Land, and it was this group of people who were descended from French voyageurs who had been trading furs, and the indigenous people who lived there. And what you see here is, there's this painting called The Trapper's Bride by Alfred Jacob Miller from 1845. And you can see these indigenous men here looking towards this white guy, this voyageur, probably French, and they're kind of offering their daughter towards him and saying, hey, you two might be a good match, you might fall in love, you might make a good couple. Also, while you're busy making a good couple, you could trade me for some kettles, and I could sell you some furs, and it might be a good thing. And, as often happens when men and women are together, a lot of people fell in love and they had kids. And that was kind of the beginning of the Métis people, where you have a mother who comes typically from the Indigenous side, and then a father who came typically from the French Canadian side, although there were some English Canadians and Scottish Canadians. And their children were kind of raised with a mix of Indigenous and French traditions. So the Métis are this group, and Métis means mixed, and they're an Indigenous group from the Red River area, what's now Winnipeg, Manitoba. And they are descended from French-Canadian fur traders who had children with Indigenous women from the Plains tribes, for example, the Cree, the Blackfoot. The Métis have their own culture that blends French and Indigenous languages, religions, and ways of life. Their lives were based on the annual hunt of bison, just like their Plains tribe forebears would have been, although they also farmed. Most Métis people spoke French and practiced the Catholic religion. Now, after Canada purchased Rupert's Land, many Métis were worried that they would lose their land to English Canadian settlers from Ontario, because the English Canadians in Ontario said, we just bought this whole thing. Why don't we move up there and fill up that land with more farms? We're running out of land in Ontario. Let's go up there and farm. But of course, the Métis were like, no, we don't want a whole bunch of English people moving up here and taking our farms, taking our land. So what they did is they kind of had a little bit of a rebellion, and they organized a government under the leadership of Louis Riel. Now, Louis Riel was a brilliant young man, really, really top-notch, very smart, very capable, and he had studied to become a priest in the Catholic Church before he'd gone to Quebec, to Montreal, I believe, to kind of study in the seminary there for several years. But then he decided that wasn't really for him. He got married and he moved back to Red River. And you can see over here, this is an arrangement of how kind of the French-Canadian farms are set up. They're very narrow, and they reach out to the river. And the idea there is that everybody can have a long, narrow strip of land that connects them to the water, whereas English farms typically were set out in kind of these big squares. And so, the Métis were worried that these English people would come, they'd turn their farms into squares, they'd take away their land, they'd make them speak English, they'd take away their religion. And so they had this guy, Louis Riel, organize their own government. However, his government faced problems pretty early, because there were some English Protestants already in Manitoba, and they started rebelling. They said, hey, you have no right to be in charge, we want to join Canada. Canada's Canada, Canada. And there was a bit of this rebellion, and there was a young man named Thomas Scott, an English Protestant, who was kind of causing trouble, he was fighting against Riel. And what ended up happening is one of the judges in Red River ordered that Thomas Scott be executed by firing squad, which is what's being shown in this image here. And what this ended up doing is it led to this kind of big conflict, this big struggle with the federal government, because many English Canadians said, no, Riel is a murderer. He's not the leader of his people. He's a murderer. He killed this man. He had no right to do so. So there was a real struggle with the federal government. Now, after some negotiations, Riel and the federal government agreed that Manitoba would join Confederation and the rights of the Métis would be protected in the bilingual province of Manitoba. So, as all this stuff around, Thomas Scott's execution is going on, Riel and the government are arguing and negotiating and eventually agree that Manitoba joins, but that the Métis have their rights protected, that they're not just going to be overrun by English settlers. But because of all this trouble, Riel went into exile in the United States. However, he later returned to Canada and he was elected as the Member of Parliament, the MP, representing Manitoba in the federal capital city of Ottawa. And over here, this is the Manitoba Legislative Building in Winnipeg. So this is where the government of Manitoba's headquarters is. And there's a giant statue of Riel there because he's kind of seen as a defender of his people, the Métis, and also of the founder of what's today that province, Manitoba. I am going to tell you that even though it looks like Riel's story is over, it is not. He kind of pops up about 15 years later in Canadian history, again in a really kind of important way. So Manitoba ends up joining Confederation in 1870, and then we switch our focus over to British Columbia. So we know British Columbia was a British colony, and after the gold rush, British Columbia was becoming really large and busy, and there were lots of people up there. And the British government back in London was like, we don't want to deal with this anymore. We want to somehow find a way to connect this with Canada. However, many of the colonists who lived in BC, they wanted to join the US. And they kind of had a good reason to do so. You know, San Francisco was much closer than Ottawa was. You could get there by boat. And the US had just bought Alaska from Russia, of course, without asking the permission of the indigenous people. So there was this idea that, oh, well, if you put Alaska plus BC plus like what's now Washington State and Oregon together, then the United States could control the entire west coast of North America. And wouldn't that be great? And of course, many of the people who lived in BC at this time were Americans who had come up from the gold rush. However, there were others in the colony who wanted to join Canada and maintain their connection with the British Empire. And eventually they went out because the federal government, the government of Canada, says, okay, we'll pay off all your pay off your colony's debt, so the money you owe, and also build a transcontinental railway from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean. So what that means is a trans means across or between, and continent, is a big plot of land. We live in North America. And so what they said is we'll build a transcontinental railway so you can get from the Atlantic to the Pacific by railway if you join Canada. In the end, they did. And the railway was called the Canadian Pacific Railway, and it still exists today. If you're ever at the railway tracks, you'll see trains that have CPR on the side, which stands for Canadian Pacific Railway. And the government of British Columbia took Canada's offer, and they joined Confederation in 1871. Now, you've seen this before, but this is about Georges Etienne Cartier, and he was our first prime minister, Sir John A. Macdonald's kind of second in command. He was kind of the French second in command to the English Macdonald. And he really took the lead on letting in Manitoba and BC. So we're going to watch this again because I think it kind of dramatizes a lot of the things that I've been talking about.
For Sir Georges Etienne Cartier, the work of uniting Canada was as vast as the country itself. First, he won over Quebec.
Union is the only way forward.
No, Monsieur Cartier! Confederation will cost French Canadians their nationality.
Monsieur, together we will form a political nationality independent of our origins.
Diversity will be Canada's strength.
Then he fought for Manitoba.
The Northwest has formed a government under Louis Riel. We will not join Confederation unless our rights are respected.
So you want a new province? Then you'll have it. There will be a place for your people in Canada.
He envisioned a country from Atlantic to Pacific.
British Columbia won't even think of joining Canada without a wagon road through the Rockies.
Ask for a railway. We are building a country, after all.
Bold as a lion, Confederation could not have happened but for him. Le Canada, son pays, ses amours.
So that's about Georges Etienne Cartier, who's one of these kind of people who brought Manitoba and BC into what is today Canada. And so if you look at 1871, what Canada looks like, and all these kind of yellow parts are what are Canada. So Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Quebec, Ontario, Manitoba, and British Columbia. And then this whole other area is called the Northwest Territories. And the Northwest Territories are just kind of this area that are directly run by the federal government. But honestly, at this point, very few non-Indigenous people live in this territory. Very, very few. It's like it's mostly Indigenous people. But the government of Canada says, okay, well, we own all this land. And the goal of the government of Canada is they've got this whole area all together, but they want to fill it, right? They're going to eventually start trying to send settlers up here and fill Manitoba and fill BC and build a railway from sea to sea, because that's Canada's motto. Ad mare usque mare, from sea to sea. We're going to build this transcontinental railway. However, building the railway was extremely difficult because it had to pass through many of Canada's landforms. So if you look at this map here, we've got different regions in our country, right? We've got where we live, the Cordillera, which is just a fancy way of saying the mountainous region. Then there's the interior plains, the prairies. There's kind of the Canadian Shield, which is a big boreal forest, and it's very boggy and kind of difficult to pass through. There's the pretty flat, pretty good for agriculture, Great Lakes, St. Lawrence region, and then the Atlantic, which is quite hilly. And so Canada has all these different landforms that are really difficult to pass through. You know, if you think of passing through mountains, you have to build bridges, you have to build tunnels, you have to go over things, you have to go under things, and that can be really expensive. Pretty cheap to build on the prairies because it's pretty flat, but in Ontario, again, it's very wet, there's lots of swamps, so you have to build through these swamps, you have to blast through rock and through hills and under hills and over hills, and so it ends up being pretty difficult. So that's one of the challenges. And at the time, there was a lot of debate in favor and against building the railway. So I want you to think of some of the arguments that people might have made in favor of and against. And I invite you to pause the video and just kind of reflect to yourself, why would somebody not want to build a railway from sea to sea in Canada at this time? What are the pros, the reasons for, and the cons, the reasons against? Well, here are a few ideas. So some of the pros are that from the Canadian perspective, it would allow for more settlement in the western region of Canada, which would allow Canada's population to increase. So you could make the country bigger. It would increase trade between the western and eastern parts of Canada, which would build Canada's economy. So it could be that you'd sell things to people in BC, and people in BC could sell things to people in Ontario, and so on and so forth. And the other reason people would like it is it would allow these settlers to move west to defend against US expansion, because the US held this idea that they were going to move up and take up the entire prairie, and that they were going to control North America. But if we put Canadians there, then they can't really do that as well. And the US also had a bunch of dangerous kind of traders, so people doing fur trading, but no longer were they selling fur trades for for useful goods. They were illegally selling alcohol and guns, which were really causing a lot of chaos in the prairie. The cons, the reasons that somebody might oppose it, is, you know, that building a railway would allow more settlers in the western region of Canada, which will disrupt the lives of the Indigenous people and possibly force them off their land, which is basically what happened. Another reason that people would oppose it is that it was extremely expensive because it crossed so many different landforms. Building a railway, which has to be pretty flat, in the mountains, which are definitely not flat, is extremely difficult, expensive, and involves a lot of dynamite. And the other thought was that it'll take really long to build because the conditions and the land are really difficult to build on. So those are some of the reasons people gave to say, don't build it. But our government wanted to build it. Sir John A. Macdonald, you know, he was very committed to the idea that we should have a railway from sea to sea, and so it got built. So construction on the railway started in 1881. Some teams to build it started in Ontario, another team started in the prairies, and another team started in Port Moody, BC. Many young men from China immigrated to BC to help build the railway. They were pushed away from China because of poverty and warfare, and they were kind of pulled here so they could have this better life for their families. If they earned enough money, they thought, that they could pay to bring over their families from China. And so for many people, moving to Canada was kind of this land of opportunity, even though, as we'll talk about in a minute, they were often not treated very fairly compared to kind of the white settlers. So now we're going to take a look at just kind of the map of the railroad's progress over the years. In 1867, and it's produced by the Alberta government to kind of teach people about our history. And what it'll show is kind of the changes that happen. So you can see there's the different parts of what is now Canada in 1867. And then as I move this slider, you notice, okay, we get to 1870, and then the government of Britain gets the Hudson's Bay Company to give Rupert's Land to Canada. So it becomes this Northwest Territories, and you've got the province of Manitoba coming in. In 1871, BC joins. And in a minute, you're going to see what starts to happen with some of the railroads. So at the moment, 1870s, very few railroads. Most of them are in the Maritimes, New Brunswick, and there's one here that's kind of in Ontario and Quebec. Notice how the railroads start to grow. 1881, this is the year that it really starts up with the railroad. They start building it. And by 1885, there's a railroad that goes across the country. And then more and more railroads come in, and more railroads come in. And eventually you begin to see Canada kind of looking like what it looks like today. Now I'm just going to take out some of the things that are kind of in the way that make it hard to see. And I'm going to switch from this map, the map before that kind of showed the different parts of the country, to a map that shows kind of the different kinds of land that are in the country. This is called elevation map. So the parts that are brown are basically really tall, really high up. And so you can see BC and Alberta, these are really kind of like hilly, mountainous areas, whereas Ontario and the prairies are pretty flat, even though in Ontario there's also problems with the amount of kind of just the amount of water, so basically like bogs and swamps. So building over the years made it very difficult to get through kind of these things, but eventually they did, right? And so we have this railway. And one of the other things going on here that I want to point out to you, which I think is kind of cool, is you've got, well, the development of cities. So 1867, there's cities kind of in the eastern part of Canada, and as the railways are built, you get a city in Winnipeg, and then they start popping up all across kind of the railway route. So let me see if I can show this again, but show you with the railroad. So as the railroads are built, you have all these cities popping up along the railway route, and that's kind of what produces Canada as a country, is that you have all these cities kind of along this route. The other thing to notice is that down here at the bottom, there's Canada's population as it's growing. So we start in 1867, and we can see that Canada's overall population is between 3 million and 4 million, so a little more than 3.5 million at the time of Confederation. And for context, in Canada right now, there's 36 million, about 36 million people. And you can see that the population goes up, right? We get to 1875, and we get about 4 million Canadians. The population keeps growing, and by 1894, 1893-ish, so about a little under 20 years, 18 years later, there's 5 million. And then 1905, so just 10 years later, there's 6 million. 1910, just 10 years later, there's 7 million. And then by 1914, there's almost 8 million Canadians. And this map, this chart here at the bottom shows the immigration, so the number of people who come in every year. So if you look at this year, 1912, almost, 375,000 people moved to Canada, which I think is just really interesting that our population goes up that way. So I'm going to switch back now to our main about Chinese immigration to BC in order to help build the railway. And I'm going to show you a short video about that too.
The Chinese workers were to undertake one of the greatest engineering feats in Canada. They worked through the treacherous Fraser Canyon from Port Moody to Eagles Pass, risking their lives in the danger zones between Yale and Lytton. It was a test of human endurance and courage.
Here is a group of people came over from a subtropical area, suddenly arriving in British Columbia in the interior, where the winters are very severe, so that quite a few also developed tuberculosis.
My father come from Guangdong province, and that being very, very warm, he was not prepared for the cold winters. And I think all the other Chinese who came here were not prepared for the cold winters. So they came here with thin clothing Chinese slippers, and they still had their pigtails. The railway did not supply them with any kind of a working glove or any hats or any working type clothing. They did not have shoes, the proper shoes. They worked with their slippers. And when the winter came and there was snow, they continued to work. And my father told me that it was so cold that he had to wrap burlap sack around his foot to keep warm. These people worked on the railway at the worst conditions you can think of. And of course, there was not sufficient food. They had little campsites, which they have a little campfire, outdoor campfire, with these pots on top of some rocks, cooking their dinner.
The life of the Chinese railway workers was very hard. He worked 12 hours a day and 6 days a week. He got paid 75 cents a day, whereas the white man or the Caucasian was paid $1.50 a day. So the white man was supplied with food and lodging, whereas the Chinese were not given any food or lodging.
So as you can see, for those kind of first Chinese immigrants who came to help build the railroad in British Columbia, it was a tough life, right? Like, it certainly wasn't easy for them. Chinese rail workers face much discrimination. That means being treated differently because of who you are. And the work was really extremely dangerous. For example, they were only paid 75 cents per day, while white workers were paid between $1.50 and $2.50 per day. And these workers' courage and strength created some of the first Chinese-Canadian communities. So some Chinese had already come over for the gold rush, and they had typically gone to California in what's now the United States before they had come up here. And then some of them settled here. And then the big kind of wave came over with several thousand, so about 15,000 Chinese people came over to help build the railway. Almost all men, but then when they earned their money, they would try to bring over their wives and their children. And that later became really difficult for them because there was much discrimination. I do want to note, you might say, what, $1.50 a day, $2.50 a day, 75 cents per day, that's nothing. Well, at that time, that was considerably more money than it is now. So at that time, your rent for the month might be something like $5 or $10. And buying, enough groceries for a week might be $1. So at that time, that money was worth more than it is. And on the note about the courage and kind of the strength of these first Chinese Canadian immigrants, I just want to show you kind of this last short video about one of the ways that an immigrant could get a whole bunch of money by doing something very dangerous.
All right, who wants to earn some danger pay? Some boat fare for the wife. All you have to do is go down in the tunnel with the nitro and set the charge.
And my wife, you pay both? Okay, I do very good. You see.
Right. Now pour it in the hole gently, understand? Any little bump, that stuff will blow.
Damn, that's the third one we lost this month. Cochrane, get another volunteer.
I went back in again, but I lost many friends. They say there is one dead Chinese man for every mile of the track.
So you can see, men like him played this kind of important role in building this railway that brought our nation together from sea to sea, and often not treated very well, doing things that kind of took incredible courage. But I also think it's interesting that, 50 years later, he's there in Vancouver and he's with his grandchildren, And that's because, despite all that, he was able to bring over his wife. He was able to, establish a family and establish a good and happy life here, which is kind of a wonderful thing. Next week, we're going to pick up on settling the West, because we've just talked about building the railway. And now we're going to talk about, how did they actually fill it with people, and how did the indigenous people who were already there kind of respond to that? And how was the western part of Canada kind of filled up? And so that's what we'll talk about next week. Thank you.